There was a moment, late in the summer of 1925, when a young man stood on a railway platform in Munich with a suitcase full of sketches and the beginnings of what would become an obsession. He was 26 years old, heavy-set already, dressed in a suit that was slightly too formal for travel, and he had come to Germany to learn how to make pictures move in ways that would disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed, though he would not have put it that way then. Alfred Hitchcock had been sent by the British studio Gainsborough Pictures to work at the UFA studios in Berlin, and what he found there in the shadows and geometries of German Expressionism was a visual language for unease, a way of making architecture itself seem complicit in whatever dread was building just off-screen. The sets were tall and angular. The lighting created pools of darkness that seemed to have weight, and the cameras moved as if they were searching for something the characters did not yet know was missing. He watched how the Germans used staircases, how they made a hallway into a tunnel, how a single light source could turn a face into a collection of planes and cavities. He was not yet a director of any consequence. He was not yet the man who would make the shower scene or the crop duster or the long fall from the Mission Bell Tower. But something in him recognized itself in those Berlin studios, in the way fear could be built from shadow and geometry, and he carried it back to England like a souvenir that would never stop unpacking itself. He had been born on the 13th of August, 1899, in Leytonstone, which was then still at the fraying edge of London's expansion, a place where the city thinned into something that remembered fields. His father, William, was a greengrocer with shops in the East End, a man who dealt in the practical business of produce and who had little patience for imagination unmoored from utility. His mother, Emma, was the one who held the household together with a kind of anxious precision, and Alfred was the youngest of 3 children, arriving late enough to feel both protected and observed. The Hitchcocks were Catholic, and in a largely Protestant England this marked them as slightly apart, slightly watched. Alfred attended Catholic schools, first at the Jesuit-run St. Ignatius College in Stamford Hill, and the education left its mark in ways he would spend his life examining from different angles. The Jesuits taught through discipline and the cultivation of guilt, and they had a fondness for mental exercises that turned ordinary situations into moral puzzles. Years later, Hitchcock would tell an anecdote that became part of his personal mythology. When he was 5 or 6 years old, his father gave a note to a police officer, who then locked the boy in a cell for several minutes as punishment for some small misbehavior. "This is what we do to naughty boys," the officer said. Whether this happened exactly as told, or whether it was a story refined in the retelling, it functioned as an origin myth for much of what followed the wrongly accused, the arbitrary nature of authority, the sudden reversal that reveals the world is not as safe as you believed. He was a solitary child, or at least that is how he remembered it, spending hours alone in his room or trailing behind his mother on errands, observing. He was not athletic. He did not roughhouse with other boys. He had a careful, watchful quality, and an early interest in maps and timetables, in the way systems worked. He collected railway schedules and could recite routes and connections, which is perhaps another way of saying he was interested in the logic of movement through space, in how a person gets from one place to another, and what might happen along the way. When he was 14, his father died. The loss did not produce any dramatic outward change, but it altered the household's economy, and Alfred left St. Ignatius to study engineering at the London County Council School of Engineering and Navigation. He learned about mechanics and electricity, about how things functioned at the level of gears and circuits, and this too would find its way into his work later, the sense that suspense was something you could engineer, that it had moving parts you could calibrate and time. His entry into the film industry was almost accidental, or at least it began as something other than destiny. In 1919, when he was 20, he took a job at the Henley Telegraph and Cable Company, where he worked in the estimating department, calculating the materials needed for electrical cables. It was respectable work, steady, but he spent his evenings reading trade magazines about the burgeoning film industry, and he started designing title cards as a freelance exercise, making little illustrated intertitles that could be used in silent films. When famous Players Lasky opened a studio in Islington, he went there with a portfolio of his designs and managed to get them interested. They hired him, first part-time and then full-time, to design title cards, and suddenly he was inside the machinery of film production. He was 21 years old, still living at home, still heavy-set and formally dressed, but now he was in rooms where movies were being planned and shot. He watched everything. He learned how sets were built, how scenes were lit, how the camera could be placed to make a room feel larger or smaller, safer or more treacherous. He worked as an assistant director, then as a screenwriter, absorbing the grammar of cinema in the way someone learns a language by immersion, without formal instruction, but with total attention. The British film industry in the early 1920s was a fragile thing, underfunded and overshadowed by Hollywood, but there were opportunities for someone willing to work across roles and learn quickly. Hitchcock moved between jobs as assistant director on one film, screenwriter on another, art director when the occasion demanded. In 1923, he was assigned to work on a film called The Passionate Adventure, and it was around this time that he met a young woman named Alma Reville who was working as a film editor. She was a year older than him, small and precise, with a sharp eye for continuity and structure. She had been in the film industry since she was 16 and knew more about the technical side of movie making than he did. They began working together, and then they began spending time together outside of work, and what developed between them was a partnership that combined affection with a mutual respect for craft. She was not intimidated by his ambitions, and he trusted her judgment in ways he did not trust his own. They would marry in 1926, and she would work on almost every film he made for the rest of his life, often uncredited, always essential. The trip to Germany in 1925 was the result of a co-production deal between Gainsborough and UFA, and Hitchcock was sent to direct The Pleasure Garden, a melodrama that is now mostly forgotten except as his first completed feature. But what mattered more than the film itself was the education he received in how the Germans built their images. The expressionist style was already fading in Berlin by then, replaced by the cooler modernism of the Neue Sachlichkeit, but its visual strategies were still in the air, and Hitchcock absorbed them whole. He learned that the world on screen did not have to look like the world outside the theater. It could be heightened, distorted, made to reflect the inner states of the characters. A shadow could anticipate a threat. A staircase could become a symbol of descent or ascent, of social hierarchy or moral fall. Lighting was not just illumination. It was a way of sculpting reality into something more legible and more dangerous. When he returned to England, he carried this knowledge with him, and it would inflect every frame he composed for the rest of his life. The British films he made in the late 20s and early 30s were modest in budget, but ambitious in craft. He directed The Lodger in 1926, a thriller about a man suspected of being a serial killer, and it was the first film that felt fully like a Hitchcock film. The story of the wrong man and innocent person caught in the machinery of suspicion would recur again and again in his work, and here it was already present in its clearest form. The lodger of the title, played by Ivor Novello, is a mysterious figure who takes a room in a boarding house just as a series of murders is terrorizing London, and the household begins to suspect he might be the killer. Hitchcock filled the film with visual ideas that announced themselves quietly but unmistakably. A shot of the lodger pacing in his room, filmed from below through a glass ceiling so that the family downstairs can see his shadow moving overhead. A close-up of a hand sliding down a banister. The tension built entirely through the audience's awareness that the person descending might be dangerous. A use of light and shadow that made ordinary domestic spaces feel like traps. The film was a commercial success, and it established Hitchcock as a director who could work within genre conventions while also bending them towards something more formally inventive. He made a string of films over the next several years, some of them forgettable, others showing flashes of what was building. Blackmail, released in 1929, was Britain's first sound film, or at least it became one midway through production when the studio decided to add synchronized dialogue. Hitchcock adapted on the fly, keeping some scenes silent and adding sound to others, and the result was a film that felt caught between two eras, but also aware of the possibilities the new technology offered. There is a scene in Blackmail where a young woman who has killed a man in self-defense sits at the breakfast table the next morning, while a gossipy neighbor talks about the murder, the word knife, repeating over and over, until it is the only word audible, a kind of oral zoom that makes the woman's guilt and fear almost unbearable. It was a small moment, but it showed that Hitchcock understood sound not as a replacement for visual storytelling, but as another tool for manipulating the audience's attention and anxiety. By the mid-1930s, he had become the most successful director in Britain, and the films from this period, The Man Who Knew Too Much in 1934, The 39 Steps in 1935, Sabotage in 1935, Sabotage in 1936, The Lady Vanishes in 1938, were the works that made his international reputation. They were all variations on the same basic structure. An ordinary person is thrust into extraordinary danger, often because of mistaken identity or accidental knowledge, and must navigate a world of spies, conspiracies, and shifting allegiances. The tone was brisk and sophisticated, mixing suspense with humor, and the films moved with a lightness that made the violence, when it came, feel all the more shocking. In Sabotage, a woman discovers that her husband is a terrorist, and in the film's most disturbing sequence, her young brother is killed in a bus explosion while carrying a bomb he does not know is a bomb. Hitchcock lingered on the boy's innocent face, on the ticking clock, on the everyday details of the bus ride, building the dread until it became almost intolerable, and then he delivered the explosion without flinching. Audiences were shaken. Critics debated whether he had gone too far, but the scene was precisely calibrated, and it demonstrated a principle that would define his work. Suspense is not about surprise. It is about giving the audience information the characters do not have and then making them wait. The films from this period also introduced what would become a Hitchcock archetype, the cool, elegant blonde woman who is drawn into danger and whose composure begins to crack under pressure. Madeleine Carroll in The 39 Steps, Nova Pilbeam in Young and Innocent, Margaret Lockwood in The Lady Vanishes. These were women who looked like they belonged in drawing rooms or on the Riviera, not handcuffed to fugitives or fleeing across the Scottish moors, and part of the film's tension came from watching them maintain their dignity even as the world around them became chaotic and threatening. Hitchcock was fascinated by this type, by the idea of a woman who seemed untouchable and then revealed herself to be vulnerable, even breakable. It was a fascination that would deepen and darken over the years, becoming something more complex and more troubling. By 1939, Hollywood had been watching, and David O. Dotchin. Selznick, the producer who had just overseen Gone with the Wind, offered Hitchcock a contract. The terms were generous, and the prospect of working with bigger budgets and better resources was appealing, but leaving England meant leaving behind the industry he had helped build and the cultural context he understood instinctively. He and Alma sailed for America in March of 1939, just months before the war began, and they brought their daughter Patricia, who was 11 years old. They settled in Los Angeles, and Hitchcock began the slow process of adapting to a new studio system, new collaborators, new expectations. His first American film, Rebecca, released in 1940, was a gothic romance based on a Daphne du Maurier novel, and it was produced by Selznick with the kind of hands-on interference that Hitchcock found suffocating. Selznick wanted the film to be faithful to the novel, to be respectable and prestigious, and he monitored every aspect of the production, sending long memos about casting and dialogue and pacing. Hitchcock chafed under the oversight, but the film was a commercial and critical success, winning the Academy Award for Best Picture and it established him in Hollywood as a director who could deliver both artistry and box office. The films that followed over the next few years showed him learning the rhythms of American filmmaking while also asserting his own sensibility. Foreign Correspondent in 1940 was a spy thriller with a spectacular set piece involving an assassination in the rain and a plane crash into the ocean. Suspicion in 1941 starred Cary Grant as a charming man who may or may not be trying to murder his wife, played by Joan Fontaine, and the film was a study in sustained ambiguity, every kind gesture from Grant's character shadowed by the possibility of malice. Shadow of a Doubt in 1943 was set in a small California town and centered on a young woman, played by Teresa Wright, who begins to suspect that her beloved uncle, played by Joseph Cotten, is a serial killer. It was one of Hitchcock's favorites among his own films, and it had a darkness that felt more personal than the glossier productions he had been making. The uncle is charming and urbane, but underneath the charm is a contempt for the world and for women in particular, and the film's climax takes place on a moving train. The uncle and niece struggling as the landscape blurs past, and it ends with his death and her survival, but the film does not offer easy comfort. The small town returns to its routines, but something has been seen that cannot be unseen. During the war years, Hitchcock also made two films that were more overtly propagandistic. Lifeboat in 1944, set entirely in a small boat adrift in the Atlantic after a ship is torpedoed, and Notorious in 1946, a spy thriller set in post-war Rio de Janeiro. Lifeboat was an experiment in confined space, all the action taking place within the boat and the surrounding ocean, and it featured a German U-boat captain among the survivors, which allowed Hitchcock to explore questions of morality and survival under extreme conditions. Notorious was something else entirely, a film that combined espionage with a deeply romantic and deeply poisoned love story. Cary Grant played an American agent who recruits Ingrid Bergman, the daughter of a convicted Nazi, to infiltrate a group of German expatriates in Brazil by marrying one of them. She agrees, in part, because she loves Grant's character, and he allows her to go through with it even though he loves her too, and the film becomes a study in how duty and desire can twist into cruelty. There is a scene where Grant and Bergman kiss, and because the production code limited the length of on-screen kisses, Hitchcock had them kiss in short bursts, pulling apart to whisper and nuzzle before kissing again, and the effect is more intimate and charged than any single long kiss could have been. The film also featured one of his most celebrated sequences, a long crane shot that begins high above a crowded party in a grand hall and slowly descends, moving through the crowd and down a staircase until it arrives at a close-up of a key clutched in Bergman's hand, the key that will unlock the secret the entire plot hinges on. It was a piece of pure cinema, the camera moving with purpose and grace, guiding the audience's attention across space and time until it arrived at the single detail that mattered most. After the war, Hitchcock entered a new phase. He formed his own production company, Transatlantic Pictures, in partnership with the producer Sidney Bernstein, and this gave him greater control over his projects. The first film under the new arrangement was Rope in 1948, an experiment in form that attempted to create the illusion of a single continuous take. The film was based on the Leopold and Loeb case, in which two wealthy young men murdered a boy to prove they could commit the perfect crime, and Hitchcock adapted it into a drawing-room drama set in real time. The camera moved through the apartment in long, unbroken shots, each one lasting up to 10 minutes, and when the film reel ran out, Hitchcock would hide the cut by moving the camera into a dark area, a character's back, a piece of furniture before resuming with the next reel. The effect was claustrophobic and theatrical, and while the film was not a commercial success, it demonstrated his willingness to push at the boundaries of what cinema could do. Under Capricorn in 1949 was another experiment, this time with color and long takes, set in 19th century Australia, but it was a critical and commercial failure, and Transatlantic Pictures folded soon after. Hitchcock returned to the studio system, this time with Warner Brothers, and he made Stage Fright in 1950, a backstage thriller set in London that was pleasant but minor. He seemed to be searching for something, trying different approaches, but the early 50s felt like a period of consolidation rather than breakthrough. And then, beginning in 1951, he entered the great sustained period of his career, a decade in which he made a series of films that were both commercially successful and formally audacious. Films that pleased mass audiences and also disturbed them. Films that could be enjoyed as entertainment, and also studied as explorations of the darker currents of desire and fear. Strangers on a Train in 1951 was the first of these, a thriller about two men who meet by chance on a train and discuss the idea of swapping murders, each killing the person the other wants dead, so that there would be no apparent motive linking killer to victim. One of the men, Bruno, is a charming psychopath played by Robert Walker, and he takes the conversation seriously, murdering the estranged wife of the other man, Guy, a tennis player played by Farley Granger. The film builds toward a climax on a carousel that spins out of control, the machinery breaking down and the carousel accelerating until it becomes a whirling nightmare. And Hitchcock filmed it with a combination of rear projection, miniatures, and location shooting that made the sequence both visceral and surreal. I Confess in 1953 was a return to the Catholic themes of his youth, a story about a priest, played by Montgomery Clift, who hears a murderer's confession and is then himself suspected of the crime, but cannot reveal what he knows because of the seal of the confessional. It was a somber, austere film, and it did not perform well commercially, but it had a moral seriousness that haunted it, a sense that there were questions about guilt and innocence that could not be resolved through plot mechanics alone. Dial M for Murder in 1954 was a chamber piece, adapted from a stage play about a husband who plans to murder his wife and make it look like a burglary gone wrong. Hitchcock shot it in 3D, though most audiences saw it flat, and while the technique was largely a gimmick, he used it sparingly and effectively, most memorably in a scene where the wife, played by Grace Kelly, reaches out toward the camera for a pair of scissors to defend herself, the hand seeming to emerge from the screen. Grace Kelly had appeared in Rear Window earlier that same year, and with her Hitchcock found the fullest realization of his ideal blonde actress, beautiful, elegant, poised, but also capable of suggesting depths of feeling beneath the surface, a certain knowingness. She would make 3 films with him in total, and in each one she played a woman who was more complicated than she first appeared, a woman who could meet the man's gaze and return it with something like challenge. Rear Window, released in July of 1954, was the film that brought all of Hitchcock's preoccupations into a single, sustained examination. It was a film about watching, about the act of looking itself, and it made the audience complicit in the gaze of its protagonist. James Stewart played L.B. Jeffries, a photographer confined to a wheelchair in his apartment after breaking his leg on assignment, and, to pass the time, he watches his neighbors through their windows across the courtyard. He begins to suspect that one of them, Lars Thorwald, has murdered his wife, and he enlists his girlfriend Lisa, played by Grace Kelly, and his nurse, Stella, to help him investigate. The entire film, except for a brief opening and closing sequence, takes place in Jeffries's apartment, and we see only what he sees or what the camera sees as an extension of his gaze. Hitchcock turned the apartment complex into a grid of individual dramas, each window revealing a different life: the lonely woman who sets a table for an imaginary lover, the newlyweds whose passion is already fading, the composer struggling with a piece of music, the dancer who practices in her underwear, and in one window the stillness and tension of Thorwald's apartment, where something terrible may have happened. The film was a meditation on voyeurism, on the way the camera itself is an instrument of looking, and on the ethical compromises involved in making and watching movies. Jeffries is passive, immobilized, but his looking is aggressive, intrusive, and the film does not pretend otherwise. Lisa, who arrives each evening in a different haute couture gown, initially seems to exist only as a decoration for Jeffries's life, but as the film progresses, she becomes the active one, climbing across the courtyard to search Thorwald's apartment, while Jeffries watches helplessly. She risks herself while he watches, and the inversion is pointed. The climax comes when Thorwald discovers he is being watched and crosses the courtyard to confront Jeffries, and suddenly the man who has been looking is himself the object of a threatening gaze, and the reversal is both thrilling and terrifying. Thorwald looms in the doorway, and Jeffries, trapped in his wheelchair, can only defend himself with the flashbulbs of his camera, the blinding light a temporary weapon, and then he is pushed backward out of the window and falls, and it is only through luck and intervention that he survives. Rear Window was a commercial success and a critical one, and it marked the beginning of a period in which Hitchcock was not just a popular entertainer, but also a figure taken seriously by critics, particularly in France, where the young writers at Cahiers du Cinéma François, Claude Chabrol, Eric Romer were developing the auteur theory and held Hitchcock up as one of the supreme examples of a director whose personality and vision shaped every aspect of the films he made. They saw in his work a consistency of theme and a mastery of form that elevated him above most of his Hollywood peers, and they wrote long, analytical essays that treated his thrillers with the same seriousness that other critics reserved for literary adaptations and prestige dramas. Hitchcock was flattered by the attention and curious about the ideas being developed around his work, and when Truffaut proposed an extended interview, Hitchcock agreed. The two men spent a week together in 1962, going through Hitchcock's films one by one, discussing technique and theme and the circumstances of each production, and the resulting book, published in 1966, became one of the foundational texts of film criticism, a masterclass in how to watch movies and how to think about the relationship between director and material. But that was still ahead. In 1955, Hitchcock released To Catch a Thief, a lighter, more playful film set on the French Riviera, with Cary Grant as a retired jewel thief, and Grace Kelly as the wealthy woman who may or may not be trying to seduce him into returning to crime. It was glossy and charming, a vacation film in both setting and tone, but it had moments that cut through the pleasantness, particularly a scene where Kelly and Grant are alone in a hotel room and she makes her interest in him unmistakable, and the dialogue is full of double entendres, and Hitchcock cuts to fireworks exploding outside, a visual punctuation that was both corny and effective. The following year, he made The Trouble with Harry, a black comedy about a dead body that keeps being buried and dug up in a Vermont forest, and it was an odd, minor film, but it introduced him to a new composer, Bernard Herrmann, who had already scored The Man Who Knew Too Much remake earlier that year. Herrmann's music was lush and dark, with a melodic sense that could turn suddenly ominous, and he understood how to support suspense without overwhelming it. He would score many of Hitchcock's greatest films over the next decade, and the collaboration became one of the most important in cinema, the music and image working together to create a mood that neither could achieve alone. In 1956, Hitchcock also began hosting a television series, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which ran for 7 years and then was revived as the Alfred Hitchcock Hour for another 3. Each episode opened with Hitchcock stepping into a drawn silhouette of his own profile, and then he would deliver a droll, sardonic introduction, often making jokes about murder and mayhem, in a tone that was both playful and faintly sinister. The show made him a household name in a way that even his most successful films had not, and it allowed him to cultivate a public persona, the rotund master of suspense, the man who could make audiences squirm and then chuckle at their own discomfort. He enjoyed the performance, and it became part of the mythology around his work, the idea that he was both genial and macabre, a figure who understood the darkness but kept it at arm's length through wit and irony. But the persona was a simplification, a way of managing the public's relationship to the work and to the man behind it. The films themselves, especially the ones he made in the late 50s and early 60s, were not ironic. They were intense, personal, and increasingly complex explorations of themes that had always been present but were now pushed to their furthest extent. The Wrong Man, released in 1956, was based on a true story about a musician, played by Henry Fonda, who is mistakenly arrested for a series of robberies and must endure the grinding machinery of the justice system while his life falls apart around him. It was shot in a stark, semi-documentary style, with real locations and a muted color palette, and it was one of the most pessimistic films Hitchcock ever made. A film in which innocence offers no protection and the system is indifferent to truth. The man's wife, played by Vera Miles, suffers a breakdown under the strain, and the film does not offer easy resolution. The real robber is eventually caught, but the damage has been done, and the final scenes are quiet and defeated. And then, in 1958, he made Vertigo. The film was adapted from a French novel, D'entre les Morts, by Pierre Boileau and Thomas Narchak, and the screenplay was written by Alec Koppel and Samuel A. Taylor, but the vision that emerged was entirely Hitchcock's, a film that felt both more personal and more abstract than anything he had made before. James Stewart played Scotty Ferguson, a former detective, who has developed a crippling fear of heights after a rooftop chase leads to the death of a fellow officer. He is hired by an old acquaintance, Gavin Elster, to follow Elster's wife, Madeline, who has been acting strangely, seeming to be possessed by the spirit of a long-dead ancestor. Scotty begins following Madeline, played by Kim Novak, and he watches her as she drifts through San Francisco visiting a museum to stare at a portrait, standing by the bay, wandering through a cemetery. She is beautiful and remote, and Scotty falls in love with her, or with the image of her that he constructs through watching. She seems unaware of him at first, or only vaguely aware, and then they meet, and she allows him into her life, and they talk, and the romance that develops is both tender and unsettling, because we have watched him watching her before she knew, and the power dynamic is already skewed. The film's first half is slow and dreamlike, saturated with color: the deep green of the bay, the red of Madeline's car, the gray stone of the Mission, and Bernard Herrmann's score is lush and mournful, a series of spiraling motifs that mirror the film's visual obsession with spirals. A spiral in Madeline's hair, a spiral staircase, a spiral painted in the museum, a spiral cut into a tree's rings, showing the passage of centuries. Scotty is drawn deeper into her mystery, and when she runs into the bell tower of an old mission and he tries to follow, but his vertigo stops him halfway up the stairs, he hears her scream and sees her body fall past the window, and he is left shattered, convinced that he failed to save her. The film could have ended there, a tragedy of obsession and loss, but it does not. The second half begins with Scotty wandering through the city, haunted by Madeline's image, and then he sees a woman on the street who resembles her. Her name is Judy. She is a shop girl from Kansas. Her hair is brown instead of blonde. Her clothes are cheaper, her manner less refined, but the resemblance is unmistakable. He approaches her, and she is wary, but he is persistent, and she agrees to have dinner with him. And then, in one of the most shocking moments in Hitchcock's work, the film reveals, through a flashback shown from Judy's point of view, that she is Madeline, or rather that she was always Judy, that she was hired by Gavin Elster to impersonate his wife, so that he could murder the real Madeline and make it look like a suicide, with Scotty as the witness. Scotty does not know this. He believes Madeline is dead and that Judy is simply a woman who happens to resemble her, but the audience knows. And for the rest of the film, we watch as Scotty, driven by his obsession, begins to remake Judy into Madeline, asking her to change her hair, her clothes, her makeup, until she looks exactly like the woman he lost. It is one of the most disturbing sequences in cinema, not because of any overt violence but because of what it reveals about the nature of desire and control. Scotty is not interested in Judy as herself. He wants the image he fell in love with, and he is willing to erase the real person to retrieve it. Judy submits, partly because she loves him and wants him to love her, partly because she is guilty and afraid, and the transformation is shown in a series of scenes that are both romantic and horrific. When she finally emerges from the bathroom, her hair dyed blonde and styled in the same way. The light around her is green and hazy, and she seems to float toward him, and he kisses her, and Herman's score swells, and it is both a fulfillment and a violation. The film's climax returns to the Mission Tower. Scotty has discovered the truth, or part of it, and he forces Judy to climb the stairs with him, confronting his vertigo and his betrayal at the same time. They reach the top, and he accuses her, and she confesses, and for a moment it seems as though they might find some way through, but then a figure appears in the shadows. A nun, and Judy, startled, steps backward and falls, and this time she really dies. Scotty stands at the edge, alone, looking down at her body, and the film ends there, without resolution, without comfort. Vertigo was not a commercial success when it was released. Audiences found it slow and confusing, and some critics were disappointed that it was not as tightly plotted as Hitchcock's earlier thrillers. But over the years its reputation grew, and it came to be seen as not only one of Hitchcock's greatest films, but one of the greatest films ever made, a work of art that was also a deeply personal confession. The film is about a man who tries to create a woman to match his fantasy, and it is also, quite explicitly, about a director who shapes actresses into the images he desires. Hitchcock had always been preoccupied with the transformation of his leading ladies, with the way a woman could be dressed and lit and directed to become something other than herself, and Vertigo made that process the subject of the film. It was as if he had turned the camera on himself, examining his own obsessions, and the result was both beautiful and damning. After Vertigo, he made North by Northwest in 1959, which was a return to the lighter, more crowd-pleasing mode of the 39 Steps, and Sabotage. Cary Grant played Roger Thornhill, an advertising executive who is mistaken for a government agent and pursued across the country by spies who want him dead. The film was a string of set pieces, an attempted murder by crop duster in an empty field, a chase across the faces of Mount Rushmore, and it was expertly crafted and immensely entertaining. But it did not have the emotional weight of Vertigo. It was a palate cleanser, a demonstration that Hitchcock could still deliver the kind of glossy, propulsive thriller that audiences loved, and it was a huge commercial success. And then, in 1960, he made Psycho. The film was shot quickly and cheaply, using the crew from his television show, and it was filmed in black and white, which was unusual for a major release at that time, but which gave the film a stark, documentary quality. The story, adapted from a novel by Robert Bloch, which was itself based on the real-life crimes of Ed Gein, begins as a tale of embezzlement and flight. Marion Crane, played by Janet Leigh, steals $40,000 from her employer and drives out of town, planning to start a new life with her lover. She stops for the night at a remote motel run by a nervous young man named Norman Bates, played by Anthony Perkins, who lives in the old house on the hill behind the motel with his domineering mother. Marion decides to return the money, to make things right, and she takes a shower, and then, in one of the most famous sequences in film history, she is stabbed to death by a figure we assume is Norman's mother. Hitchcock shot the scene with extreme care, using 78 camera setups and 50 cuts over the course of 45 seconds. The knife never actually touches the body on screen. The violence is created entirely through editing and sound, through the quick flashes of the blade and the water, and Marion's face and the blood swirling down the drain. The sequence is both abstract and visceral, a kind of visual assault, and it ends with a long, slow shot of Marion's eye, lifeless, and then the camera pulls back to show her body slumped over the edge of the tub. The effect on audiences in 1960 was seismic. The star of the film, the character the audience had been following and identifying with, was suddenly dead, only a third of the way through the story, and everything that followed took place in the shadow of that rupture. The second half of the film shifts focus to Norman, and as Marian's sister and lover arrive to investigate her disappearance, the film becomes a slow revelation of Norman's psychosis. His mother is dead, has been dead for years, preserved in the house, and Norman has taken on her identity, dressing in her clothes and speaking in her voice, and it was he who killed Marian, believing himself to be his mother in those moments. The film ends with Norman in custody, sitting in a cell, his mother's voice now fully dominant in his mind, and a final image of Marian's car being pulled from the swamp where Norman had hidden it, her body still inside. Psycho was a sensation. It was shocking in ways that mainstream cinema had not been before, and it made an enormous amount of money, becoming one of the highest-grossing films of Hitchcock's career. But it also marked a shift in his work and in the culture around him. The film's violence was more explicit, more visceral than anything he had done before, and it opened the door for a new kind of horror film, one that was less about suspense and more about shock. The shower scene became iconic, endlessly parodied and analyzed, and Norman Bates became one of the defining villains of cinema, the soft-spoken boy next door, who was also a killer. But there was something else at work in Psycho, something that connected back to Vertigo and would carry forward into the films that followed. Both films were about men who were trapped by their obsessions, who could not see the women in front of them as separate, autonomous beings, who could only relate to them through control or fantasy. And in both films the women died, casualties of the men's desires and delusions. Hitchcock's next film, The Birds, released in 1963, was an ambitious departure, a horror film without a clear explanation, based on a short story by Daphne du Maurier. Tippi Hedren played Melanie Daniels, a wealthy socialite who follows a man, played by Rod Taylor, to a small coastal town in Northern California, and while she is there, the birds begin to attack. First a few, then more, then massive flocks of them, diving at people, swarming into houses, and the film builds toward a sustained sequence of avian assault that is both terrifying and surreal. Hitchcock used a combination of live birds, mechanical birds, and optical effects, and the result was uneven but often startling. There is no explanation given for why the birds attack, no resolution that makes sense of the chaos, and the film ends with the main characters driving away through a landscape filled with silent, watching birds, and the sense is not of victory, but of temporary reprieve. Tippi Hedren was a model whom Hitchcock had discovered, and The Birds was her first major film role. He shaped her performance with obsessive attention, dictating her movements, her expressions, the way she held herself, and she later described the experience as both exhilarating and exhausting, a kind of total control that left little room for her own choices. For the final attack sequence, where Melanie is trapped in an attic and pecked by birds, Hitchcock had originally planned to use mechanical birds, but at the last moment he decided to use live ones, and for 5 days Hedren was subjected to birds being hurled at her, clawing and pecking, until she was bruised and bloodied and eventually collapsed from exhaustion. The footage is harrowing, and it is difficult to watch without thinking about what was required to create it. After The Birds, Hitchcock made Marnie in 1964, a psychological thriller about a woman, again played by Tippi Hedren, who is a compulsive thief and who suffers from traumatic amnesia related to a childhood incident. She is pursued and eventually blackmailed into marriage by a man, played by Sean Connery, who is fascinated by her and determined to cure her. The film is deeply uncomfortable, not least because the relationship is essentially coercive, and the climax involves the man forcing the woman to confront her repressed memories in a scene that is staged as a kind of psychoanalytic breakthrough, but which also feels like another form of violation. The film was not well received at the time, and it has remained one of Hitchcock's most divisive works, but it is also one of his most revealing, a film in which the director's desire to control and reshape the woman at the center is not hidden, but is instead the explicit subject of the story. During the production of Marnie, Hitchcock's behavior toward Tippi Hedren became increasingly inappropriate. He made romantic overtures that she rejected, and when she refused him, he became cold and controlling, refusing to let her out of her contract or to allow other directors to hire her. Hedren has spoken publicly about the experience in later years, describing it as a sustained campaign of harassment and psychological manipulation, and her account has been corroborated by others who were present during the production. It is a deeply troubling aspect of Hitchcock's legacy, made more troubling by the fact that the films themselves are so clearly about the dynamics of control and obsession that he was enacting in his professional relationships. He made films that explored the violence of the male gaze, the way men use women as objects to fulfill their fantasies, and he did so with insight and precision, but that insight did not prevent him from engaging in similar behavior himself. The films anticipated the critique, but the man did not change. After Marnie, Hitchcock's career entered a slow decline. He made Torn Curtain in 1966, a Cold War thriller with Paul Newman and Julie Andrews that was meant to be a return to the espionage films of his earlier period, but it felt tired and uninspired, and the production was troubled by conflicts over the script and the casting. Bernard Herrmann composed a score that Hitchcock rejected, and it was the end of their long collaboration, a rupture that Herrmann never fully recovered from. Topaz in 1969 was another espionage film, based on a novel by Leon Uris, and it was even less successful, a sprawling, unfocused narrative that lacked the precision of his best work. Frenzy, in 1972, was a return to London, and a return to the kind of thriller he had made in the 1930s, about a serial killer who strangles women with neckties and the innocent man who is suspected of the crimes. It was his most explicit film in terms of violence and sexuality, and while it had moments of the old craft-along tracking shot that pulls away from a murder scene, moving down the stairs and out into the street, leaving the horror behind a closed door, it also felt harsh and somewhat cruel, and the film's treatment of its female characters was particularly brutal. His final film, Family Plot, released in 1976, was a lighter affair, almost whimsical, about a fake psychic and her boyfriend who become entangled with a pair of kidnappers. It was modest and mildly entertaining, but it did not feel like the culmination of anything. It felt like a coda, the work of a man who was tired and no longer able or willing to push himself toward new discoveries. By the late 1970s, Hitchcock's health was failing. He had suffered from arthritis for years, and he was overweight and increasingly immobile. He continued to develop projects, but none of them came to fruition. In 1979, the American Film Institute gave him a Life Achievement Award, and he appeared at the ceremony, frail but alert, accepting the honor with a brief, gracious speech. It was one of his last public appearances. He died on the morning of April 29, 1980, at his home in Bel Air, with Alma beside him. He was 80 years old. He was buried in a private ceremony, and his remains were later cremated and scattered. In the years since his death, his films have been analyzed and reanalyzed, taught in film schools, written about in academic journals and popular criticism. Vertigo, which was initially a commercial disappointment, has been embraced as a masterpiece, and in the 2012 Sight and Sound poll, it displaced Citizen Kane as the greatest film ever made in the eyes of critics. Rear Window and Psycho remain fixtures of film history, and even the lesser-known films from his British period have been rediscovered and appreciated for their craft and innovation. But the conversation around Hitchcock has also shifted, particularly in recent decades, as the accounts of Tippi Hedren and others have come to light, and as scholars and critics have examined the gender dynamics of his films with greater scrutiny. There is a recognition now that his work, for all its brilliance, is deeply implicated in the structures of power and control that it depicts. The films show us men who watch women, who try to possess them, who sometimes destroy them, and they do so with a clarity that is almost clinical. But the man who made those films was himself complicit in similar patterns, and this creates a complicated legacy, one that cannot be resolved by simply celebrating the work or simply condemning the man. The films remain. They are still watched, still studied, still capable of producing the effects they were designed to produce: suspense, dread, a kind of fascinated discomfort. They are formally sophisticated and emotionally complex, and they operate on multiple levels at once as entertainment, as psychological exploration, as critiques of the very mechanisms they employ. To watch a Hitchcock film is to be made aware of the act of watching, to be implicated in the gaze, to feel the pleasure and the unease of being positioned as a voyeur. The films know what they are doing. They know that the camera is an instrument of intrusion, that suspense is built on withholding and revealing, that the audience is willing to be manipulated as long as the manipulation is skillful enough, and they use that knowledge without apology. There is a moment in Vertigo, after Scotty has forced Judy to transform herself back into Madeline, when they kiss and the room around them seems to dissolve, replaced by the livery stable where they had kissed before, the place where Scotty first believed Madeline loved him. The image spins, the colors bleed together, and it is both a representation of his subjective experience, his memory, and fantasy collapsing into the present, and a visual metaphor for the way obsession distorts reality, makes it impossible to see clearly. The woman in his arms is not Madeline, has never been Madeline, but he cannot see Judy because he is looking at a ghost he has created. And the film, in that moment, makes visible the process by which desire becomes destruction, by which love becomes control, by which a person becomes an object. Hitchcock understood this. He made it the subject of some of his greatest work, and he also enacted it in his life, in the way he treated the women who worked for him, who trusted him, who gave him their performances and sometimes their well-being. The contradiction is not easy to resolve. The films do not excuse the behavior. The behavior does not diminish the films. Both are true at once, and both have to be reckoned with. In the end, what remains is the work itself, the 53 feature films and the hundreds of hours of television, the images and sequences that have become part of the language of cinema. The shower scene, the crop duster, the birds massed on the jungle gym, the long climb up the bell tower, the key in the hand, the glass of milk glowing in the dark, the shadowy figure on the staircase. These images are indelible, and they continue to shape the way we think about suspense, about fear, about the ways that cinema can manipulate time and space and emotion. They are part of the vocabulary that every filmmaker since has inherited, whether they know it or not. Hitchcock's great subject was control, how to achieve it, how it feels to lose it, how it corrupts those who wield it and damages those who are subjected to it. He explored it through the mechanics of suspense, through the structure of his narratives, through the relationships between his characters. And in doing so, he created a body of work that is both thrilling and deeply unsettling. Work that entertains and also asks difficult questions about the nature of desire and power and the ways that people use each other. He was a man of contradictions. He was meticulous and obsessive, but also capable of sudden improvisation. He was shy and socially awkward, but he cultivated a public persona that was confident and droll. He was an artist of extraordinary vision and discipline, and he was also a man who abused his power and caused real harm to people who were vulnerable to him. Both things are true. Both things have to be acknowledged. The films are still there, waiting to be watched. They are beautiful and cold and sometimes cruel, and they do not offer easy comforts. They ask you to look, and then they make you aware that you are looking, and then they ask what it means that you want to keep looking. They are works of control that also explore the costs of control. They are masterpieces made by a man who understood the mechanisms of power and who used them in his work and in his life in ways that were both illuminating and damaging. There is no simple moral to be drawn from Alfred Hitchcock's life or work. There is only the work itself and the life that made it, and the ongoing conversation about how we understand the relationship between the two. He made some of the greatest films in the history of cinema. He also caused real pain to people who depended on him. Both of those things will be part of his legacy, and neither can be separated from the other. In one of the last interviews he gave, not long before his death, Hitchcock was asked what he thought his films were about. He thought for a moment, and then he said simply, "People in jeopardy." It was a characteristically understated answer, but it was also accurate. His films were about people in danger, people who found themselves in situations they did not fully understand, people who were watched and hunted and sometimes destroyed. And the danger was not always external. Sometimes it came from within, from the desires and obsessions that people carried with them, from the ways they tried to control the world and the people around them, from the violence that could erupt when control was lost or when it was maintained too tightly. That is what the films show us again and again, and perhaps that is enough. Not an answer, but a sustained examination. Not a resolution, but a question that keeps being asked in different forms, across different stories, in images that linger long after the screen has gone dark. The birds are still there, massed on the hillside, silent and waiting. The woman is still falling from the tower. The wrong man is still running. The camera is still watching. And we are still watching too, unable to look away, even when we know we should, even when we understand what it means that we cannot stop.